The story we're covering today comes from one of Robert Greene's books that I read many years ago, The 48 Laws of Human Nature. Some of the story I'll paraphrase, and occasionally I'll read directly from the book. Jacques Danton was born October 26, 1759, in a region in northern France called Champagne. And yes, that is where Champagne originated after the Romans planted vineyards in the 1st century AD. Danton was a leading figure in the French Revolution. He was a modest and relatively unknown lawyer before the French Revolution. However, Danton would soon become a famous orator of the Cordelier Club, and was eventually given responsibilities in government as the French Minister of Justice, following the fall of the monarchy on the 10th of August, 1792. Danton was said to have been a very large man with an exceptionally enormous head. Some called him a giant. He had the reputation of looking rather strange, and to some, perhaps, just downright ugly. Now, all that sounds rather harsh, but here's the thing. In addition to his naturally unfortunate appearance, as a toddler growing up on a farm, Danton had twice been run over by bulls and survived smallpox. Some considered him rather frightening, but most found him to be so charming and exuberant that they were able to completely overlook his face. He was born to a family of peasants. However, his father was working on his education at the time, and he eventually managed to become a lawyer, which raised the family up into the expanding French middle class. Unfortunately, Danton's father had died when he was just 3 years old, but Danton's mother was not about to allow that to prevent her son from getting a good upbringing. Now, jumping ahead a bit, the coronation of King Louis XVI would take place on June 11, 1775, and among the spectators in the crowd was Jacques Danton. Look, I know I'm not going to be pronouncing any of these names correctly throughout this story, so just have mercy on me, please. At the time of King Louis XVI's coronation, Danton was a 15-year-old student at a boarding school in the town of Troyes. It was said that Danton was not the intellectual type. He preferred physical activities like swimming in the nearby river and those sorts of things. The one subject that had interested him, however, was history, particularly ancient Rome. With Danton's powerful speaking voice, he was a natural at the art, but he wasn't very good at writing. Now, around this time, the priest who ran the school Danton was attending decided to have a contest to see who could write the best essay. Danton desperately wanted to win the essay prize. He thought that for sure this would boost his status among the ranks of his fellow students. So Danton reasoned that the only way to make up for his not-so-great literary skills was to witness the king's coronation take place firsthand. He also felt some kind of connection to the young king. They were not far apart in age, and both were large and both decidedly unhandsome. Playing hooky in order to get to where the coronation would take place, only 80 miles away, was just the kind of adventure that had always attracted him. His fellow students recalled him saying, "I want to see how a king is made." So he snuck off to the town of Reims the day before the coronation and arrived just in time. He maneuvered his way throughout the crowd of French people who had congregated outside the cathedral. Guards brandishing tall pikes held them back, and only the nobility was allowed inside. Danton pushed as far forward as he could, and then there he was. Danton had spotted the king. The king was wearing the most spectacular ceremonial robe encrusted with diamonds and gold, making his way up the steps. Also there that day, following behind him, was the queen in a splendid gown, her hair pulled impossibly high, followed by other members of her entourage. From a distance, it seemed like they were all figures from another era, so different from anybody he had ever seen before. He waited patiently outside for the end of the ritual, at which point the king re-emerged, now this time wearing his new crown. For a brief moment, he got a closer look at King Louis's face as he passed by. Danton was surprised. The king seemed, well, ordinary. The king then got into the most elaborate carriage imaginable. It was like something out of a fairy tale. It was built specifically for the coronation and designed to represent the chariot of Apollo, glistening like the sun being the symbol of the French king. On all sides, it featured statuettes of Roman gods, On the door panel facing Danton, you could see an elaborate painting of King Louis XVI as a Roman emperor atop a cloud, beckoning the French people below him. Strangest of all, the carriage itself even sported its own crown, an enormous crown made of bronze. Danton returned to school later that day. His head was spinning with these images, and inspired by what he had just seen, Danton wrote his best essay yet and won the prize. I have no idea what this prize was. Hopefully it wasn't a few hours alone with the priest. Probably the last words you want to hear from a priest. Come over here and I'll give you a large prize. In 1780, he moved to Paris to work as a law clerk in the courts. Within a few years, he passed the bar exam and became a practicing lawyer. In court, with his booming voice and oratorical skills, he naturally commanded attention and quickly rose through the ranks. And as he mingled with his fellow lawyers and read the newspapers, he detected something strange going on in France. A growing discontent for the royal family and the arrogant upper class, whom the great thinkers of the day were ridiculing in their plays and books. Basically, social media turned against the royals, the comedians turned against the royals, and Danton seized the writing on the wall. The main problem was the country's finances. France seemed perpetually on the brink of running out of money, and at the root of all this was France's vastly antiquated financial structure. The French people were subject to a tax system that dated back to the feudal times, a system that the clergy and nobility were largely exempt from, by the way, and the taxes on the French lower and middle class could never bring enough revenue, especially considering the lavish expenditures of the French court, which had only gotten worse with Queen Marie Antoinette's elaborate parties and the love of finery. France is starting to sound more and more like a place I know. As the supply of federal money ran short and the price of basic essentials kept rising, and with millions of people facing starvation, riots began to break out throughout the countryside and even in Paris. In 1787, as the financial situation worsened, the opportunity of a lifetime came to Danton, a position as a lawyer on the King's Council, with a rather nice bump in salary. Wanting to marry a young woman named Gabriella, whose father was opposed to the marriage because Danton didn't earn enough money, Danton then accepted the position on the council, despite his fears that it was a sinking ship. 2 days later, he married Gabriella. Danton did his job well, but found himself increasingly absorbed by the turmoil in Paris. He joined a club called the Cordeliers. Its members were an odd mix of bohemian artists and political agitators. And since this club was located near his apartment, Danton was able to spend a great part of his day there. Soon he was even participating in the ruckus debates about the future of France that took place at the club. I guess one positive thing about Danton's less than favorable appearance is that Gabriella didn't need to worry when he came home late from work. In 1788, he was offered a higher position on the King's Council, but he turned it down. He told the King's minister who represented the offer that the monarchy was doomed. He said, "Look, this is no longer about modest reforms. We're more now than ever on the brink of revolution. Can't you see the avalanche coming?" he tells this guy. Only a month before the convening of the Estates General, riots in Paris had broken out over the price of bread, and royal troops had even shot into the crowds, killing dozens of people, and Danton had witnessed this firsthand. So he shared the people's desperation and anger, and the people of France could no longer be placated with the usual rhetoric from the politicians and government spokespeople. So Danton began to address the angry crowds on the street. This caused him to attract something of a following. Eventually, Danton had made a name for himself. A friend of his who had noticed this new direction that Danton's life was taking said it was as if Danton had jumped into a strong tide in the river, letting it carry him anywhere it might go. Meanwhile, the genius king comes up with a plan. He decides to be a better king and actually start serving the people he represents and spend less time serving his own interests. Just kidding. The king instead decided to impress upon the people the majesty of the monarchy and the monarchy's absolute necessity as the supreme power in France. Make them depend on me, that was the king's plan. To do so, he would hold the Estates General at Versailles rather than whatever other location was being considered. The king's advisors warned him not to do that, considering Versailles' closeness to Paris and all its agitators. But old King Louis didn't listen. Instead, the king doubled down on his plan. He would hold an opening ceremony that would be even more extravagant than his own coronation. He intended to remind everyone of the divine origin of his kingship, In other words, he was put there by God. The king's plan was to first impress them with the weight of the past, then agree to some minor tax reforms, lowercase r. At the same time, he would make it clear that under no circumstance would the monarchy or the first two estates relinquish any of their powers or privileges. You had to see that coming. In this way, the government would get its necessary funds through taxes, and the traditions of the king would remain unchanged. This, quite predictably, didn't have its intended effect, and the people of France had become even more vocal with their discontent. As he faced a growing uprising throughout the country, Louis sensed the urgency of nipping this problem in the butt. Those pesky commoners are unhappy again, so he said to hell with any attempts at conciliation, and he instead resorted to force. He called in the army to establish order in Paris and elsewhere, but the Parisians, anticipating Louis's use of military, were quickly arming themselves, looting military stockades, and the French troops who had moved in to quell the rebellion were unreliable. Many of them refused to fire on their compatriots. I gotta hand it to the French, that's not something you always hear about in history. Something like 9 out of 10 people will do what the government tells them to do or someone in authority tells them to do, regardless of whether it's moral or not. At least according to research like Milgram's obedience to authority test and things. And that's how you get things like Nazi Germany and so on. Anyway, Paris was in the hands of the people now, and there was nothing Louis could do. He watched with horror as the National Assembly, still meeting Versailles, quickly voted to eliminate the various privileges enjoyed by the nobility and the clergy. And I friggin' love this part, in the name of the people, they voted to take over the Catholic Church and auction off to the public the vast lands that it owned. In the following weeks, King Louis wandered the halls of the palace, alone, moping like a little prick, all the paintings and august symbols of Louis XVI staring back at him in mockery of all that he had allowed under his rule. So he thinks to himself, somehow I just have to retake control of France. So he tries to have a banquet for one of the military units that he believed would be loyal to him, and it kinda worked. The banquet was successful in solidifying the king's relationship with this portion of the army, but by that time it was too late. Thousands of Parisians were now marching on Versailles, armed and dragging cannons. On the morning of October 6th, a group of citizens penetrated into the palace, killing everyone in their path. They then demanded that Louis and his family be escorted back to Paris so that the French citizens could keep a closer eye on him. Within a week of his arrival in Paris, the king received a visit from a strange man, whose face and manner frightened him. The man was Jacques Danton, who was now one of the leaders of the French Revolution. On behalf of the French people, he had come to welcome the king to Paris. He explained that he had been a member of the king's council, and he reassured the king that the people were grateful for his submission to their will, and that there was still an important part for the king to play. For example, the monarch could swear allegiance to a new constitution, a constitution that the people agreed upon. But King Louis could barely listen. He was transfixed by the man's enormous head, by the strange outfit he wore, a mix of fashion styles that King had never seen before. The king was also taken aback by his whole manner, his fast way of talking, the lack of awe and respect in the king's presence. Danton had bowed graciously before the king, but he refused to kiss the king's hand, which was quite the breach of protocol. So Louis thought to himself, this was a revolutionary? This was a man of the people? Louis had never met such a fellow, and he found the experience decidedly unpleasant. But before long, old Louis had returned to his old ways of trying to regain as much power as possible, through various forms of manipulation, appealing to those with strong feelings of nationalism and empty promises to those who would remain loyal. Typical politician stuff. And again, he was successful. He even managed to escape to Paris. Don't play with your food, I always say. They should have executed him on the spot. But the rebellion would get a third chance to do the right thing, and the king was eventually recaptured. And this time he was immediately put on trial for treason and was found guilty. Louis was determined to put on a brave face. On the morning of January 21st, a cold and windy day, he was transported to the place where an enormous crowd had gathered to witness the execution. They watched in stunned amazement as the former king had his hands tied and his hair cut like an ordinary criminal. He climbed the stairs to the guillotine, and before kneeling at the block, He cried out to the people, "I die innocent. I pardon those who sentenced me. I pray to God that my blood does not fall again over France." It's said that as the blade fell, he emitted an extremely pitiful cry. Then the executioner held up his head high for all those to see. Then, after a few cries of "Vive la Nation," a deathly silence fell over the crowd. Minutes later, they rushed the scaffolding to dip their hands in Louis's blood and to buy locks of his hair, souvenirs that would undoubtedly become quite valuable. Shortly after the execution of the king, Danton traveled to Belgium to help it oversee the war effort in that front. While there, he received news that his beloved wife, Gabriella, had died in premature childbirth. He felt horribly guilty for not being by her side in that moment, and the thought that he had no chance to say goodbye to her and that he would never see her again was unbearable. Without taking even the slightest moment to consider the consequences, he abandoned his mission in Belgium and hurried back to France. By the time he arrived, his wife had been dead for a week and buried in the public cemetery. Overwhelmed with grief and the desire to see his wife one more time, he hurried to the cemetery, bringing with him a friend and a few shovels. And so, on a moonless, rainy night, they managed to find her grave. Danton dug and dug fervently, without ceasing. After hours of this, his shovel finally struck the top of the coffin. He then carefully lifted the casket out of the ground, and with much effort pried the lid off. Upon seeing Gabriella, he gasped at the sight of her bloodless face. He then pulled her out onto his lap, hugging her tightly to his body, begging her to forgive him. He kissed her again and again on her cold lips, and after several hours, he finally acquiesced to his friend's request to return her to the ground. In the months to come, something seemed to have changed in Danton. Had it been the loss of his wife, or was it the guilt he now felt for having unleashed the terror within France? He had ridden the wave of the revolution to its peak, but now he wanted it finished. He became less and less engaged in the affairs of the state and was no longer in favor of the terror, as it was known. Danton's main rival for power noticed the change and began to spread the rumor that Danton had lost his revolutionary fervor and could no longer be trusted. The smear campaign was effective. On March 30th, 1794, Danton was arrested and brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and his rivals made sure he was found guilty and sentenced to death. As Danton laid his neck on the chopping block, he yelled to the executioner, "Make sure you show my head to the people. It's worth a look."